What if everything you thought you knew about history was just one possible outcome in a sea of infinite alternatives? Picture a world where the greatest battles were won by the underdogs, where empires never fell, and where pivotal decisions went the other way. History as we know it is written by the victors, but what if the story had unfolded differently? The past is not just a fixed chain of events, it's a delicate balance of moments that could have tipped in countless directions. And today, we're diving into 25 of the most mind-bending historical what-ifs, scenarios so game-changing that they might have reshaped our world beyond recognition. Think about the last time you made a small decision turning left instead of right, saying yes instead of no. Now imagine that same ripple effect on a global scale, where a single choice could rewrite the fate of nations. What if the Library of Alexandria had never burned, preserving ancient knowledge that might have propelled humanity forward centuries earlier? What if a storm had delayed Columbus, altering the course of exploration forever? These aren't just hypotheticals, they're windows into worlds that might have been, and the consequences are staggering. This journey isn't just about speculation, it's about understanding how fragile our reality truly is. Every war, every invention, every leader who rose or fell could have gone another way, and today we're unraveling those threads. From the battles that almost weren't won to the discoveries that nearly slipped through our fingers, these alternate histories don't just challenge what we know, they make us wonder what could still be possible. So settle in, because by the end of this exploration, you'll never look at the past the same way again. The question isn't just what if, it's what else. And the answers might just change how you see everything. Alexander the Great stood at the height of his power, his empire stretching from Greece to the edges of India. But what if his life hadn't been cut short at just 32? The man who toppled Persia and spread Greek culture across 3 continents was on the brink of even greater ambitions when fever took him in Babylon. Had he lived another decade or two, the entire Mediterranean world might have bowed before him. Picture a timeline where his armies turned west, marching into Italy before Rome could rise to dominance. The Roman Republic, still in its infancy, would have faced an unstoppable force, Hellenistic phalanxes backed by battle-hardened cavalry, and the sheer momentum of a conqueror who never lost a fight. Instead of Latin becoming the language of empire, Greek might have dominated Europe centuries earlier, reshaping law, philosophy, and even the foundations of Christianity. But Alexander's gaze didn't stop at Italy. Carthage, the maritime superpower of the age, would have been next. Imagine his legendary siege tactics turned against those formidable walls, with war elephants clashing on the shores of North Africa. A victory there could have rerouted history's economic arteries, with trade flowing through Alexandria instead of Rome, and the Mediterranean unified under a single crown long before Caesar's time. Even more tantalizing is the question of religion. Alexander saw himself as a living god, blending Greek and Eastern traditions. A longer reign might have accelerated the fusion of faiths, creating a Hellenistic world where Zeus and Ammon were worshipped side by side from Spain to the Punjab. Yet his greatest legacy could have been stability. Alexander's sudden death tore his empire apart as generals fought for scraps, but with decades more to rule, he might have cemented a lasting dynasty. No wars of succession, no fractured kingdoms, just a single, sprawling civilization sharing ideas, art, and innovations. The Silk Road could have flourished centuries earlier, with Greek science meeting Chinese ingenuity long before Marco Polo. And without Rome's eventual dominance, Europe's feudal divisions might never have taken root, leaving the continent permanently intertwined with Asia. One man's lifespan held the potential to erase the divide between East and West, rewriting the map of history itself. The irony, the future of 2 continents hinged on something as fragile as a fever in Babylon. A Hellenistic world unbroken by Alexander's death wouldn't just have delayed Rome's rise, it might have erased it altogether. the Roman Republic, still a scrappy city-state when Alexander died, faced a choice: adapt or be crushed. Without the power vacuum left by his empire's collapse, Rome's legions would have met their match in Macedonian phalanxes and Persian-inspired cavalry tactics. Picture a timeline where Roman law never became Europe's foundation, where Latin remained a regional tongue, and where the Senate's rise was smothered in its cradle. The very idea of republic might have been a footnote replaced by Alexander's model of divine kingship stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. Religion would have taken an entirely different path. Christianity emerged in a Roman world, its spread shaped by imperial roads and Pax Romana. But in a Hellenistic superstate, Paul's letters might have been written in Greek to audiences already steeped in a blend of Greek philosophy and Eastern mysticism. Imagine a version of Christianity that absorbed even more elements of Zoroastrianism or Egyptian cults, with Alexander himself revered as a precursor to the Messiah. The Nicene Creed could have included debates over whether Zeus or Yahweh was the true father of Christ, or whether they were different faces of the same God in a syncretic empire where such blends were commonplace. Science and technology might have leaped ahead centuries earlier. Alexandria's library was just the beginning, with a stable empire funding scholars and linking trade routes. Think of the innovations that could have flourished. Archimedes might have collaborated with Indian mathematicians, Aristotle's pupils exchanging ideas with Chinese astronomers. The Antikythera mechanism, that ancient Greek computer, hints at what could have been had such devices been mass-produced instead of lost in the chaos of Rome's fragmented successor states. Steam engines, precision gears, even early chemistry could have transformed the Mediterranean world before the Common Era began. And then there's the East. Alexander dreamed of reaching China, and a longer-lived conqueror might have bridged the gap between Hellenistic and Han dynasties. Picture Greek art influencing terracotta warriors, or Chinese paper technology accelerating the spread of Greek philosophy. The Silk Road wasn't just about goods, it was about ideas, and a unified empire could have made that exchange constant instead of sporadic. Europe might never have plunged into a dark age, because the knowledge of antiquity would have flowed uninterrupted from Greece to India to China and back. The twist: all this hinged on a single moment in Babylon, a different treatment for Alexander's fever, a body stronger from fewer battle wounds, even a delay of that fateful drinking party. Any of these could have reshaped the map of history so profoundly that our modern world would be unrecognizable. The Hellenistic era wasn't just a pause between empires, it was a road not taken, one that could have led us to a universe where East and West weren't concepts, but a single intertwined destiny. Flames crackled through the halls of the great Library of Alexandria, reducing 500,000 scrolls to ash. Works by Aristotle, treatises on mathematics from Babylon, medical texts from India, and astronomical charts that mapped the heavens with startling precision. But what if those fires had never been lit? Historians still debate who burned it, whether Julius Caesar's siege, Christian riots, or later Muslim conquests. Yet the staggering truth is this: losing Alexandria wasn't just the destruction of a building. It was the erasure of 1,000 potential futures, a setback so colossal that some scholars believe it delayed human progress by half a millennium. Imagine walking those intact shelves, where Euclid's geometry shared space with lost plays by Sophocles, where Heron's blueprints for steam engines sat beside precise calculations of Earth's circumference by Eratosthenes. This wasn't just a repository of knowledge, it was an active research hub where scholars debated, experimented, and built machines that wouldn't be reinvented until the Renaissance. Had those scrolls survived, the Dark Ages might never have been so dark. Think of Archimedes' death ray, dismissed as myth until modern engineers recreated its parabolic mirrors to ignite ships at a distance. Now picture that technology refined over centuries instead of forgotten. Roman armies with Greek fire, medieval cities lit by early electric batteries described in those lost text histories timeline could have leapt forward in ways that seem like science fiction. The real tragedy was the silencing of diverse voices. Alexandria collected translations from Persian, Hebrew, and Indian scholars, creating a dialogue between civilizations that wouldn't reconnect until the age of exploration. A surviving library might have preserved Babylonian astronomy predicting planetary motions with eerie accuracy, or Hindu manuscripts detailing the concept of 0 centuries before it reached Europe. Muslim scholars like Al-Hazen later rebuilt fragments of this knowledge, but what if they'd inherited it whole? The scientific method, often credited to the Enlightenment, had roots in Alexandria's rigorous debates. With uninterrupted access, Galileo might have stood on the shoulders of giants instead of rediscovering their work. Religion and philosophy would have transformed too. Early Christian theologians like Origen studied there, blending Greek logic with scripture. A thriving library could have fostered a less dogmatic faith, where Coptic Gnostic Gospels remained in conversation with Platonic ideals. Even the Quran, which praised Alexandria's wisdom, might have integrated more of that heritage into Islamic Golden Age scholarship. The rift between faith and reason, a tension that sparked centuries of conflict, could have narrowed into a seamless exchange. Then there's the tantalizing what-if of navigation. Ptolemy's geography, one of the few surviving works, contained maps hinting at lands beyond Europe. Complete archives might have given explorers like Columbus precise charts of the Atlantic currents, or even whispers of the Americas from Phoenician traders. The age of discovery could have begun in the 1300s, with Venetian ships reaching India by circumnavigating Africa using Alexandrian coordinates. But perhaps the greatest loss was momentum. Knowledge isn't just facts, it's a chain of inspiration. Each burned scroll represented dead ends in thought, theories abandoned for lack of predecessors' notes. The Industrial Revolution didn't start with James Watt's steam engine. It started with Watt reading about ancient Greek automata. Now picture a world where that chain remained unbroken, where Leonardo da Vinci accessed Heron's pneumatics instead of reinventing them from scratch. The rhythm of progress wouldn't have been a series of rediscoveries, it would have been a sprint. The fire at Alexandria didn't just steal answers, it erased the questions we never got to ask. Every modern breakthrough, vaccines, spaceflight, quantum computing, might have happened generations earlier if scholars hadn't spent centuries groping in the dark for fragments the library once held. One institution's survival could have reshaped our world so profoundly that today we might be debating ethics for interstellar colonies or curing diseases that haven't yet evolved. The past isn't just what was, it's everything that almost was, and Alexandria's ashes haunt us with that might have been. A lone Greek inventor named Heron of Alexandria tinkered with steam power in the 1st century, not as a curiosity, but as a force strong enough to open temple doors by divine will. His Eolipile was the world's first steam turbine, a whirling bronze sphere that hinted at revolutions to come. Now picture that spark catching fire. Had Alexandrian engineers paired Heron's designs with the metallurgy of Damascus steel, steam-powered ships might have plied the Mediterranean while Rome still stood. The implications ripple outward like shockwaves: medieval farmers harvesting with mechanical reapers, windmills grinding grain replaced by coal-fed engines, entire cities lit by gas lamps fed through pipes of Roman concrete. The Industrial Age could have dawned alongside the fall of Constantinople, changing everything from textile production to the very rhythm of human labor. Warfare would have transformed beyond recognition. Archimedes' claw, a crane-like weapon that capsized invading ships, was just the beginning. Compound that with steam-driven catapults hurling incendiary bombs, or treaded vehicles inspired by his screw pump moving siege towers without oxen. The Mongols might have faced walled cities defended by rapid-fire ballistae, their horse archers outranged by pressurized artillery. Even gunpowder, when it arrived from China, could have merged with precision Greek gears to create repeating cannons centuries before the Renaissance. The balance of power wouldn't have shifted slowly, it would have shattered, with empires rising and falling at the speed of innovation. Daily life would scarcely resemble our medieval past. Surviving texts suggest the ancients understood the basics of electricity. The Baghdad battery may have been more than a curiosity. Imagine electrified streets in Cordoba powered by water wheels, or surgeons using sterilized instruments heated in steam autoclaves. The Black Death might have been countered by germ theory emerging from Alexandria's medical scrolls, with quarantine protocols backed by microscopic observations from early lenses. Food preservation could have leaped forward with mechanical ice makers based on evaporation principles, extending trade routes and preventing famines. The true game changer, navigation. Ptolemy's star charts combined with precision astrolabes might have given rise to sextants by the year 1000. Viking longships equipped with compasses and Arabic-influenced Latin sails could have reached the New World not as accidental drifters, but as systematic colonizers. The spice trade wouldn't have waited for Portuguese caravels. Byzantine steam galleys might have cut the journey to India in half, bypassing Silk Road middlemen entirely. Picture Islamic geographers mapping the Gulf Stream, their findings disseminated through printing presses reconstructed from descriptions in the lost scrolls. Yet the most profound shift would have been in thought itself. Continuous technological progress from antiquity onward could have rendered the very concept of Dark Ages obsolete. Universities in Constantinople might have taught Newtonian physics alongside Aristotelian philosophy, their scholars debating quantum probabilities instead of how many angels fit on a pinhead. The Renaissance wouldn't have been a rebirth, it would have been an unbroken ascent, with Da Vinci's notebooks filled not with rediscoveries of Archimedes, but refinements of working steam engines and electric generators. One thread connects these possibilities: the fragility of knowledge. Heron's inventions became party tricks for wealthy Romans, while Archimedes' war machines were dismissed as impractical. Without the library's destruction, these ideas might have found patrons who saw their potential, innovators who stacked breakthrough upon breakthrough. The timeline we inhabit, where steam power waited 1600 years after Heron, isn't the inevitable path of progress. It's the detour, the road littered with abandoned prototypes and burned blueprints. The real surprise isn't that antiquity had these glimpses of the future. It's that we ever convinced ourselves they were mere curiosities instead of the first sparks of a fire that nearly lit the world. The Western Roman Empire didn't collapse in a single cataclysm. It eroded, buckling under barbarian migrations, economic strain, and political rot. But pull one thread differently: a stronger navy to repel Vandals, better grain shipments to prevent urban decay, a single decisive victory over Attila, and the entire fabric of history might have held. Imagine a world where Rome never fell, where the Senate still convened in a functioning curia, and where legions patrolled roads stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. This wasn't just about preserving an empire. It was about avoiding 1500 years of fragmentation, where the unity of Mediterranean trade, law, and language never shattered into feudal shards. Without the fall, Europe's political landscape would have evolved under Roman bureaucracy rather than warlords. Think of Charlemagne's fragmented empire replaced by a continuous line of administrative provinces, where tax collectors and judges answered to a central authority instead of local strongmen. The Roman legal code, refined over centuries, might have prevented the patchwork of feudal laws that made crossing a river mean submitting to a new lord's whims. Serfdom's chokehold on medieval peasants could have been broken by the remnants of Roman labor systems, where tenant farmers still had rights codified in parchment rather than arbitrary noble decrees. The very concept of Dark Ages might never have existed, just an unbroken line of census records, land surveys, and infrastructure maintenance stretching back to Augustus. Infrastructure would have been Rome's greatest legacy. Aqueducts maintained by imperial engineers would have kept cities like Lyon or Carthage thriving metropolises instead of crumbling ruins. The roads that carried Caesar's couriers might have later transported mechanical clocks and printing presses, their routes patrolled by a standing army that crushed regional rebellions before they birthed new nations. Had Rome held Britain, Londinium's sewers could have prevented plagues that devastated medieval populations, while Spanish silver mines under imperial management might have funded a standing navy to explore the Atlantic centuries before Portugal. The Viking Age would have met Roman coastal forts with Greek fire and standardized artillery, turning raids into suicidal missions. Religion's path would have diverged dramatically. Constantine's conversion tied Christianity to imperial power, but what if that alliance endured? A stable Rome might have prevented the Great Schism between East and West, keeping bishops from Constantinople and Rome under one ecclesiastical hierarchy. Heresies like Arianism could have been stamped out not by warfare but by centralized doctrinal courts, creating a more uniform Christianity without the Protestant Reformation's fractures. Islam's rise in the 7th century would have faced a unified Mediterranean superpower instead of a weakened Byzantium and fractured Europe. Picture Muslim traders integrating into Roman markets under imperial treaties rather than conquering North Africa from crumbling Visigoths. The Crusades might never have happened, replaced by diplomatic exchanges between Rome and Baghdad over silk and spice routes. Technological stagnation wasn't inevitable. Roman engineers were tinkering with steam engines and gear systems before the empire's collapse. With continuous funding, they might have industrialized provinces using water mills and mechanical looms, skipping the cottage industry phase entirely. The Antikythera mechanism proves they understood complex clockwork. Imagine such devices mass-produced to coordinate planting seasons or navigation. Even slavery, Rome's moral blind spot, might have declined faster under sustained economic pressure, replaced by steam-powered cranes and spinning jennies. The Renaissance wouldn't have been a rediscovery of classical knowledge. It would have been the next logical step in an unbroken chain of innovation. Most startling is the linguistic ripple effect. Latin's survival as a living language might have prevented the fragmentation into French, Spanish, and Italian dialects. Scholars from Britain to Syria would have debated in Ciceronian Latin, making the works of Newton or Descartes accessible without translation. The very word Europe could have remained a geographical term rather than a political one, as Roman identity overshadowed tribal loyalties. No 100 Years' War, no Inquisition, no competing nation-states, just a single, sprawling civilization enduring like China's dynasties, adapting rather than collapsing. Yet the greatest what-if lies in governance. Rome's republic to empire trajectory might have eventually birthed early constitutional monarchy, with power sharing between Senate and Emperor evolving into something resembling modern democracy. America's founding fathers drew on Rome's example. Imagine their inspiration coming not from ruins but from a living, breathing system that had weathered 15 more centuries of reform. The twist, our world of nation-states, vernacular languages, and even the Industrial Revolution's timing wasn't destiny. It was the accident of an empire's failure to patch its cracks. Rome's fall wasn't inevitable. It was just one possible outcome in a universe where a few different choices might have kept the eternal city standing until the stars themselves seemed within reach. Rome's sprawling bureaucracy and vast infrastructure could have been the perfect incubator for industrialization if the empire had harnessed the right innovations. Picture a world where the same roads that moved legions also transported coal from Britain's mines to steam engines powering factories in Gaul. Rome's centralized tax system funneled wealth into massive projects like the Colosseum, and aqueducts. Imagine that same machinery funding state-sponsored workshops producing precision gears or standardized parts. The empire already had proto-industrial scale in its weapon factories, where standardized gladius swords and ballista bolts were mass-produced. Shift that model to textiles or agriculture, and you'd have water-powered looms weaving tunics by the thousand, or mechanical reapers harvesting Egyptian grain for export. Industrialization wouldn't have waited for 18th century Britain. It might have begun in the damp hills of northern Italy, with Roman engineers refining water mills into turbines. The ripple effects on colonialism would have been profound. Instead of medieval Europe stumbling onto the Americas by accident, imagine Roman carracks with reinforced steel hulls and steam-assisted sails methodically mapping the Atlantic. Carthage's old trading posts in West Africa might have become colonies fueling Rome's furnaces with gold and iron, while Indian cotton shipped through the Red Sea could have fed textile mills in Antioch. The empire's thirst for resources would have turned exploration into a calculated enterprise, not a gamble. Spanish conquistadors relied on local alliances and luck. Roman legions would have arrived with prefabricated forts, standardized supply chains, and roads already planned for newly conquered territories. The New World wouldn't have been discovered. It would have been audited, catalogued, and integrated into imperial ledgers. Global power structures would have bent to Rome's mechanized might. China's Han Dynasty and Rome traded silk for glass, but with industrial output, the balance could have tipped decisively westward. Roman steam-powered pumps might have drained the Dutch marshes 1,000 years early, turning northern Europe into a breadbasket. The Sahara's gold routes could have been bypassed entirely by railroads stretching from Alexandria to Timbuktu, making trans-Saharan caravans obsolete. Even the Mongol hordes might have met their match against legions armed with early gunpowder artillery. Crude, yes, but mass-produced in the foundries of Germania. The Silk Road would have been just one spoke in a wheel of Roman commerce stretching from Scotland to Sumatra. Yet the darkest twist might have been slavery's persistence. Rome's economy relied on human muscle, and industrial machines could have prolonged that dependence rather than ending it. Enslaved laborers might have been forced to operate dangerous machinery in steam-powered mills, their lives expendable in a system that valued output over humanity. Alternatively, labor scarcity from plagues could have accelerated automation, pushing Roman engineers to develop mechanical reapers and cranes to replace lost workers. The abolitionist movements of the 19th century were born from Enlightenment ideals, but in a Rome that never fell. Those ideas might have been suppressed by an imperial church justifying bondage as the natural order. Technologically, Rome's path could have leapfrogged entire eras. Concrete recipes lost after the empire's fall might have evolved into reinforced steel frameworks, making skyscrapers possible by the Middle Ages. The Antikythera mechanism's clockwork could have led to mechanical computers managing grain shipments or calculating taxes. Even medicine might have advanced faster. Galen's writings suggest rudimentary germ theory, and with industrial-scale glass production, microscopes could have revealed bacteria centuries before Leeuwenhoek. The Black Death might have been countered by quarantine protocols enforced by a centralized government, not squabbling feudal lords, the greatest irony. Rome's fall wasn't inevitable. A few more competent emperors, a slightly more resilient tax base, or one less civil war might have steadied the ship long enough for these innovations to take root. Our timeline's industrialization required the collapse of feudalism and the rise of merchant classes. But Rome had the capital, the roads, and the bureaucratic machinery to skip those steps entirely. The empire that gave us concrete, central heating, and mass production was closer to a factory age than we realize. What held it back wasn't lack of genius, but the fragility of systems that couldn't withstand their own weight. The Industrial Revolution didn't have to wait for James Watt. It could have been born in the smoke of Pompey's workshops, changing everything except the relentless march of time itself. The Mongols reached the gates of Vienna in 1241, their scouts probing the forests of Austria while European kings trembled. But what if those scouts had pressed forward and the Golden Horde's cavalry had flooded into France and Italy? Europe wouldn't have just been conquered, it would have been remade. The Mongols didn't just destroy, they connected, stitching continents together with trade routes and tolerating religions from Nestorian Christianity to Buddhism. Under their rule, Paris might have boasted Persian-style observatories tracking celestial movements, while Venetian merchants traded silks from Cathay alongside German amber in bustling markets policed by Mongol arbitrators. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical thought, could have been preempted by a flood of Eastern knowledge, gunpowder recipes from Chinese alchemists, advanced mathematics from Samarkand's scholars, and medical texts from Baghdad's House of Wisdom, all funneled westward through Mongol-administered roads. Gutenberg's printing press, often credited with spreading Renaissance ideas, might have arrived far earlier, not with Latin Bibles, but with her script manuals on paper-making technology from Karakoram. The Mongol Empire was a relay race of innovation. Persian engineers improved Chinese siege weapons, Tibetan doctors shared medical knowledge with Arabic physicians, and Russian scribes translated Mongolian decrees into a dozen tongues. This cross-pollination could have reached Europe at the very moment its universities were emerging. Thomas Aquinas might have debated Buddhist monks in Parisian lecture halls, while Florentine artists incorporated Tibetan mandala symmetry into their frescoes. Even feudalism's rigid hierarchies could have crumbled faster under the Mongol meritocracy, where a talented scribe or warrior, regardless of birth, could rise to govern provinces. The darkest twist lies in what might have been suppressed. The Renaissance flourished in Italy partly because Mongol conquests bypassed the peninsula, leaving city-states like Venice and Florence free to experiment. Under direct Mongol rule, the Medicized patronage might have been diverted to glorifying the Great Khan instead of funding humanist scholars. Da Vinci's inventions could have been drafted not for independent republics, but for Mongol governors demanding better siege engines or irrigation systems. The very concept of Europe as a distinct cultural sphere might have dissolved, replaced by a Eurasian identity where a Hungarian nobleman felt closer kinship to a Yuan dynasty administrator than to a Spanish bishop. Yet the greatest transformation could have been linguistic. The Mongols adopted her script for official documents, and their empire functioned in a Babel of Turkic, Persian, and Chinese. Latin, already fading, might have been replaced entirely as the lingua franca by a hybrid tongue blending Slavic, Mongol, and Italian elements, something modern linguists call Euro-Asian Creole. Shakespeare's sonnets could have been composed in verse forms borrowed from Mongolian epic poetry, their rhythms unrecognizable to our ears. Religion would have taken stranger turns. The Mongols patronized all faiths but answered to none, and their tolerance might have prevented the Catholic Church's dominance. Nestorian Christianity, thriving under Mongol protection in Central Asia, could have rivaled Rome's authority, while Buddhist lamas debating Dominican friars in Cologne's cathedrals might have been a common sight. The Protestant Reformation, born from frustration with papal corruption, might never have been necessary, or it could have arrived centuries earlier, as reformers drew on Mongol imported ideas about decentralized spiritual authority from Tibetan Buddhism. The ultimate irony, Europe's backwardness after Rome's fall made the Renaissance possible. Fragmentation bred competition, and the lack of a central authority allowed heresies and innovations to flourish. A Mongol conquest would have brought stability, but at the cost of that chaotic creativity. We might have gained gunpowder armies and porcelain sooner, but lost the slow simmer of ideas that birthed Descartes, Copernicus, and the scientific revolution. The Mongols didn't just fail to conquer Europe, they spared it, leaving a vacuum where the modern world could gestate. Sometimes the greatest historical gifts come not from what empires achieved, but from where they stopped. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it unraveled the very fabric of medieval Europe, leaving villages empty and fields untended. Yet the plague that claimed 60% of the population might have been far worse. Picture a world where 9 out of 10 Europeans perished, where Paris and London became ghost towns, and where the stench of rotting crops mingled with the silence of abandoned monasteries. This wasn't just a demographic catastrophe, it was a reset button pressed so hard that the gears of history might have jammed permanently. With 90% mortality, the immediate shock would have shattered feudalism beyond repair. Lords returned from crusades to find no serfs left to till their lands, their titles meaningless when there were 10 workers alive for every 100 needed. The scarcity of labor could have accelerated automation at a dizzying pace. Watermills and wind pumps redesigned to replace human hands, early mechanical seeders patrolling empty fields like metal scarecrows. Venice's arsenal, already a proto-factory, might have turned its assembly lines toward mass-producing labor-saving devices, creating a 15th-century industrial revolution born not from prosperity but desperation. Religion would have faced existential collapse. The Church's promise of divine protection rang hollow when priests died alongside their flocks. Survivors might have turned to radical mysticism or abandoned Christianity entirely, blending remnant rituals with pagan survival cults. Imagine a Europe where the Reformation happened overnight, not as a theological debate, but as a primal scream against a silent God. The Vatican could have dissolved into warring factions, its authority replaced by local shamans preaching apocalypse or anarchist communes rejecting hierarchy altogether. Technologically, necessity would have bred inventions we can scarcely imagine. With entire guilds wiped out, blacksmiths, masons, weavers' knowledge would have consolidated in the hands of a desperate few. The printing press might have emerged decades earlier as a tool for preserving craft techniques, each manual a lifeline against collective amnesia. Medical research, no longer constrained by Galen's dogma, could have leaped forward through brutal trial and error autopsies performed openly in streets littered with corpses, leading to germ theory centuries ahead of schedule. The geopolitical landscape would have inverted. Depopulated Europe might have become a vacuum sucked dry by stronger neighbors. The Ottoman Empire could have walked into Vienna unopposed, its janissaries met by weeds growing through cobblestones. Chinese treasure fleets, finding no meaningful resistance, might have established trading colonies in a Europe too weak to refuse. The New World's discovery could have been reversed, Aztec merchants sailing east to barter with the ragged survivors of Lisbon or Cadiz. Yet the most haunting question is cultural. What happens to art when 90% of its audience vanishes? The Renaissance's masterpieces might never have been commissioned, replaced by utilitarian diagrams for rebuilding civilization. Dante's Inferno could have been the last great work of literature for generations, its visions of hell overshadowed by lived horror. Music would have simplified, no cathedrals left to house polyphonic choirs, just solitary minstrels singing survival chants in half-remembered Latin. The cruel paradox, such devastation might have birthed a more egalitarian world. With feudal bonds broken, the few remaining laborers could have demanded unheard-of rights, not through revolution but through sheer leverage. A carpenter surviving in Milan might have been paid in gold and land just to rebuild a single roof. Women, often spared by plague due to less exposure in homebound roles, could have seized control of abandoned businesses and estates, rewriting inheritance laws by default. The concept of nobility might have dissolved when the last duke starved in his castle, unable to find a single servant to bring him bread. Our timeline's Black Death reshaped Europe, but a 90% die-off wouldn't just reshape it. It would erase entire cultures, leaving blank parchment where history was meant to be written. The survivors wouldn't have rebuilt medieval Europe, they'd have built something entirely new from its bones. Whether utopia or dystopia, we'll never know. The plague's true legacy wasn't just death, it was the eerie silence of roads untraveled, books unread, and futures that never were. The year was 1519 when Hernan Cortés stood before Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan, a city grander than any in Europe, floating gardens, zoos of exotic beasts, streets so clean they gleamed. But the Spanish conquistador wasn't there to admire the architecture. His eyes were fixed on the gold adorning the temples, the wealth of an empire he intended to claim for Spain. Now rewind that moment. What if the Aztecs had seen through Cortés' deceptions, united their rival city-states, and crushed the invaders before smallpox could even arrive? The Americas wouldn't just have resisted conquest, they might have forged a future where indigenous civilizations dictated the terms of engagement with Europe. Tenochtitlan's survival would have reshaped the continent's destiny. The Aztecs weren't static, they were innovators, building chinampas that yielded bumper crops and mastering hydraulics to control lake levels. Without Spanish disruption, their mathematicians might have refined the calendar further, their astronomers tracking Venus with precision rivaling Tycho Brahe. Picture a Mesoamerican Renaissance where scribes translated Nahuatl poetry into bound codices instead of watching them burn in missionary bonfires. Trade routes could have stretched uninterrupted from the Great Plains to the Andes, with Aztec merchants bartering obsidian for Peruvian silver, creating an economic network to rival the Silk Road. Warfare would have evolved differently too. The Aztecs initially mistook Spanish steel for brittle stone, but after defeating Cortés, they'd have reverse-engineered captured weapons within years. Imagine eagle warriors clad in armor forged from melted Spanish breastplates, their macuahuitl swords embedded with Toledo steel edges. By the time England or France attempted colonization, they'd have faced unified Mesoamerican armies armed with gunpowder adapted from Chinese designs traded across the Pacific. The New World might have remained new only to Europeans, its borders guarded by empires that had turned invaders' technology against them. Religion would have taken a spectacular detour. The Spanish forced conversion at sword point, but a victorious Aztec empire might have syncretized Christianity on its own terms. Quetzalcoatl's prophesied return could have been reinterpreted as a call for reform, blending the crucifix with the plumed serpent. Jesuit missionaries arriving decades later might have found themselves debating theology with Aztec priests fluent in Aquinas, or worse, outmaneuvered by a state religion that absorbed useful Christian elements while preserving the cult of Huitzilopochtli. The Vatican's grip on the Americas would have fractured before it even began. The ripple effects on global economics are staggering. Spanish gold and silver looted from the Aztecs bankrolled Europe's wars and fueled the price revolution, a tidal wave of inflation that reshaped feudalism. Without that influx, the Habsburgs might have defaulted earlier, leaving France or the Ottomans dominant. The transatlantic slave trade, initially fed by indigenous captives, would have lacked its early momentum. African kingdoms, facing less demand for human chattel, could have redirected their energies toward resisting later colonization. The entire Atlantic economy might have pivoted around Mesoamerican maize and cocoa instead of Caribbean sugar and Virginian tobacco. Then there's the tantalizing what-if of cross-continental alliances. The Aztecs knew of the Inca through trade networks. Had they survived, these empires might have formed a defensive pact against European encroachment. Picture Inca roads carrying Aztec obsidian to Andean battlefields, while Quechua and Nahuatl diplomats negotiated with Dutch merchants in ports the Spanish never controlled. The Mapuche in Chile held off conquistadors until the 19th century. Imagine their struggle backed by Mesoamerican engineers and metallurgists. Europe's age of expansion could have met an unbreakable wall of indigenous cooperation. Yet the darkest twist lies in disease. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish, but isolation might have bought time. Tenochtitlan's baths and sanitation systems suggest public health awareness. Had the empire survived Cortés, quarantine measures could have slowed outbreaks until natural immunities developed. The Americas' population collapse wouldn't have been 90%. It might have been 50 or 30, leaving enough survivors to maintain cultural continuity. Today's Nahua and Maya speakers could have been the majority in their homelands, not marginalized remnants. The greatest irony, Spain's victory wasn't inevitable. Cortés survived multiple near captures, and his alliance with Tlaxcala, the Aztecs' bitter rivals, hinged on fragile diplomacy. One different choice, one missed ambush, and the Aztec Empire might have endured long enough to witness Europe's own fractures during the 30 Years' War. The conquest wasn't destiny, it was a knife's edge, balanced on a moment when the right alliance, the right insight, could have tilted the scales toward a world where the Americas wrote their own history, not just survived ours. Aztec agriculture was anything but primitive. Their floating gardens, called chinampas, were feats of engineering fertile plots built on lake shallows using woven reeds and dredged mud, yielding up to 7 harvests per year where European fields struggled with one. Had these techniques spread globally, the face of modern farming might look radically different. Picture Dutch polders evolving centuries earlier under Aztec tutelage, or rice paddies in Southeast Asia incorporating chinampa-inspired irrigation. The Aztecs didn't just farm, they terraformed, turning swamps into breadbaskets without plows or draft animals. That knowledge lost to conquest could have revolutionized food production from the Nile Delta to the Ganges, making famine a rarity rather than a recurring nightmare. The Incas' mastery of vertical agriculture was equally groundbreaking. Their stepped terraces clinging to Andean slopes defied gravity, fed by aqueducts that redistributed mountain snowmelt with precision. These weren't just fields, they were climate-controlled microenvironments, with crops grown at specific altitudes to suit each plant's needs. A world where Inca agronomists shared their techniques might have seen alpine villages thriving on terraced vineyards at 10,000 feet, or Saharan oases blooming with frost-resistant potatoes bred from Andean stock. The Irish potato famine, caused by monoculture collapse, could have been avoided entirely with the Incas' genetic diversity strategy, cultivating thousands of potato varieties to ensure blight couldn't wipe them all out at once. Then there's the matter of wealth. The Aztecs and Incas didn't just hoard gold, they wore it, traded it, and valued it as ornamentation rather than currency. Had their empires survived contact, the global monetary system might never have adopted gold standards. Instead of European banks stockpiling ingots, imagine economies backed by cacao beans, the Aztec money that grows on trees, or by labor credits measured in woven cloth like the Inca quipu system. Spanish bullion fleets reshaped world finance by flooding Europe with stolen metal, but intact Mesoamerican civilizations could have offered an alternative. Economies rooted in perishable commodities that required constant renewal, discouraging wealth hoarding and encouraging sustainable cycles of production. Global trade routes would have bent toward the Americas as equals, not colonies. Aztec merchants already plied Pacific waters in giant canoes, while Inca roads stretched 25,000 miles, enough to wrap around the equator. With European interference delayed, these networks might have connected with Polynesian voyagers and West African traders, creating a multipolar world economy. Spanish galleons carrying silver to China were one-sided exploitation. Aztec-Chinese trade could have been an exchange of equals: jade for obsidian, silk for parrot feathers, gunpowder recipes for chocolate recipes. The Columbian Exchange wouldn't have been a one-way extraction of American resources, but a genuine barter of ideas and goods. Perhaps most transformative would have been the ecological impact. The Americas before Columbus weren't untouched wilderness, they were managed landscapes. Aztec botanical gardens cultivated medicinal plants from across the empire, while Inca terraces prevented the soil erosion that plagues modern agriculture. European settlers saw forests as timber to clear. Indigenous civilizations saw them as partners, practicing agroforestry with crops grown beneath canopy cover. If these philosophies had shaped global land use, the Industrial Revolution might have unfolded with an environmental ethic baked in, slowing the rampant deforestation and species loss that followed. The very concept of conservation could have arrived 4 centuries early, not as a reaction to crisis, but as standard practice. The cruelest twist is how close this alternate world came to existing. When Cortés first marched on Tenochtitlan, he had fewer than 600 men against an empire of millions. His victory wasn't predetermined. It was a fluke of timing, alliances forged with disgruntled city-states, and the devastating luck of smallpox arriving at the perfect moment. Change any one variable, and the Aztecs might have endured long enough to meet later European arrivals as trading partners rather than victims. The Americas wouldn't have been the New World. They'd have been the balancing weight on history's scale, ensuring no single hemisphere could dominate the other. The conquest wasn't fate. It was a fragile house of cards that collapsed at the slightest breeze, taking with it futures we can only now glimpse through the veil of what might have been. The fields of Waterloo were muddy underfoot on that fateful June afternoon in 1815, the air thick with cannon smoke and the screams of charging cavalry. Napoleon Bonaparte, the strategist who had redrawn Europe's map for over a decade, watched as his old guard faltered under Wellington's relentless defense. But shift one variable, a delayed Prussian arrival, a cavalry charge held back 30 minutes, a single miscommunication in British lines, and history pivots. A French victory wouldn't just extend Napoleon's rule. It would lock into place a continental order where Paris replaced London as the engine of modernity. The Napoleonic Code, already spreading like legal wildfire, might have become the universal standard from Lisbon to Moscow, eroding feudal privileges and enshrining meritocracy centuries before democracy's rise. Imagine a Europe where every birth certificate, property deed, and marriage license followed the same rationalized French template. The code's emphasis on equality before the law, however imperfectly applied, would have undercut aristocratic power structures still clinging to life in Prussia and Austria. Serfdom in Eastern Europe, which persisted into the mid-19th century, could have been abolished overnight by French administrators, even more radical. The Code's inheritance laws, which mandated equal division among heirs, would have shattered the great estates that fueled noble families' dominance. The Rothschilds and Habsburgs might have watched their influence crumble as land fragmented and talent trumped bloodline. German unification, when it finally came, would have worn a French mask. Prussia's humiliating defeat at Jena in 1806 had already shown the weakness of its patchwork kingdoms. A second Napoleon win could have dissolved them entirely. Instead of Bismarck's blood and iron welding Germany together under Prussian militarism, imagine a confederation of the Rhine surviving as a French client state, its universities teaching in French, its courts ruling by Napoleonic precedent. The cultural reunification of German-speaking peoples might still have happened, but through shared resistance to French hegemony, creating a very different nationalism steeped in linguistic pride rather than authoritarian discipline. Economically, the implications are staggering. Britain's blockade had already pushed Napoleon to promote industrial self-sufficiency. Victory at Waterloo would have cemented this continental system as permanent policy. French factories, shielded from British competition, might have leapfrogged ahead in textile and metallurgical innovation. The Industrial Revolution's center of gravity could have shifted south, with Lyon's silk mills and the Ruhr's coal mines feeding a unified European market. No tariffs, no petty principalities disrupting trade routes. The pound sterling's dominance, replaced by the franc as the global reserve currency, its value backed by an empire stretching from Antwerp to Rome, religion's role would have transformed too. Napoleon's concordat with the Pope was a marriage of convenience, and his victory might have emboldened him to further subordinate the Church to state control. Seminary schools could have been replaced by secular lycées teaching Enlightenment rationalism, while Vatican influence dwindled to ceremonial pageantry. Protestant Britain, isolated and outmaneuvered, wouldn't have been able to prop up missionary efforts in Africa or Asia, leaving those fields open to French Catholic orders or to a newly assertive secular humanism exported from Parisian salons. Then there's the colonial chessboard. A triumphant Napoleon might have reclaimed Haiti, not with slavery abolished in France since 1794, but with indentured labor schemes that reshaped Caribbean sugar production. Louisiana, sold off in 1803 to fund European wars, could have been repurchased as a breadbasket for French settlers. With the Royal Navy no longer dominant, French Egyptology expeditions might have solidified claims along the Nile, turning North Africa into a constellation of departments as integrated as Provence. The scramble for Africa, when it came, would have had Paris holding the rulebook, yet the greatest change might have been psychological. Napoleon's defeat cemented the idea that empires could be toppled by coalitions. His victory would have enshrined the opposite lesson, that a determined superpower could defy the world. 20th century dictators might have drawn different conclusions from his career, seeing not the futility of overreach but the rewards of relentless ambition. The Congress of Vienna's delicate balance of power would never have existed, leaving Europe without the century of relative peace that allowed capitalism and liberalism to flourish. Instead of a world order built on cautious diplomacy, we might have inherited one shaped by Napoleonic audacity. For better or worse, the irony, Waterloo wasn't the epic clash of destiny we imagine. Napoleon was exhausted, his marshals past their prime, his enemies learning from past mistakes. Change just one of those factors, and the legend of invincibility might have carried him through. Europe's 19th century didn't have to belong to Victorian morality and Prussian discipline. It could have been the era where revolutionary ideals, for all their contradictions, burned brighter than ever. The only certainty is that the world would have measured time differently, not in before Christ or after Christ, but in before Napoleon and after. The cannons fell silent at Appomattox in 1865, sealing the Union's victory. But what if Robert E. Lee's gamble at Gettysburg had succeeded, or European powers had intervened on the Confederacy's behalf? A Southern victory wouldn't just have preserved slavery, it would have birthed a fractured North America where two hostile nations glared across the Mason-Dixon line. The Confederate States of America, built on cotton and human bondage, would have faced existential challenges from day one. Their constitution explicitly barred abolition, locking millions into generational servitude while industrialization crept forward at a snail's pace. Meanwhile, a humiliated United States, stripped of its agricultural heartland, might have turned inward, a second-rate power unable to challenge European colonialism in the hemisphere. The 20th century wouldn't have belonged to America. It might not have belonged to democracy at all. Slavery's persistence would have twisted global economics in grotesque ways. Confederate leaders dreamed of expanding their peculiar institution into the Caribbean and Latin America, creating a slave empire stretching from Texas to Tierra del Fuego. Brazilian and Cuban plantations might have formed alliances with Richmond, turning the Gulf of Mexico into a closed market for human chattel. Britain's textile mills, dependent on southern cotton, could have turned a blind eye to this expansion, undermining abolitionist movements worldwide. The transatlantic slave trade, officially banned since 1807, might have revived under new euphemisms: contract laborers, shipped from Angola to Alabama under Confederate flags. Industrialization wouldn't have ended slavery. It could have industrialized it, with steam-powered cotton gins and railways built by enslaved crews working under even more brutal efficiency. The ripple effects on race relations would have been catastrophic, with slavery legally enshrined as a positive good in Confederate ideology. Jim Crow segregation might have spread northward as the weakened United States sought compromise with its southern neighbor. Canada could have become the primary destination for escaping freedom seekers, straining British North America's capacity to resist Southern demands for extradition. Scientific racism, already gaining traction in Europe, would have found its strongest patron in the Confederacy: state-funded research proving white supremacy, disseminated through textbooks and international conferences. The very concept of civil rights might have been stillborn, with global movements for equality discredited as Yankee interference in Southern domestic affairs. Geopolitically, a divided North America would have reshaped every major conflict, Without a unified United States projecting power, Spain might have clung to Cuba and Puerto Rico into the 20th century. France could have expanded its Mexican adventure, propping up Maximilian's regime as a buffer against Confederate expansion. Most chillingly, the absence of American industrial might have tipped the balance in World War I toward the Central Powers. The Kaiser's Germany, supplied by Confederate cotton and unchecked by U.S. troops arriving in 1917, could have dictated terms at Versailles. Hitler later cited the Confederacy as an inspiration for his racial laws. In this timeline, he might have found an eager trading partner across the Atlantic, with Confederate diplomats quietly approving the annexation of Austria and the invasion of Poland. Technological progress would have suffered under the Confederacy's agrarian obsession. While the North pioneered steel mills and electrical grids, the South prioritized maintaining its feudal economic model. The Wright brothers might have lacked funding for their experiments in a diminished United States, delaying manned flight. Edison's labs could have relocated to Toronto or Montreal, beyond the reach of Confederate patent laws. Even the atomic age might have unfolded differently. Los Alamos sits in territory the Confederacy claimed. Without that land, the Manhattan Project may never have found a secure home. Soviet spies would have had two rival American governments to play against each other, potentially leaking nuclear secrets to both sides in a nightmarish three-way Cold War. Yet the most haunting question is cultural. American literature, music, and film drew deeply from the struggle for racial justice. From Uncle Tom's Cabin to the Harlem Renaissance to To Kill a Mockingbird. In a Confederate victory scenario, these voices might have been silenced or forced into exile. Jazz, born from the collision of African rhythms and European harmonies in New Orleans, could have remained a forbidden folk tradition rather than conquering global airwaves. Hollywood, if it existed at all, might have churned out propaganda films glorifying plantation life instead of wrestling with America's contradictions. The moral authority of the civil rights movement, which inspired anti-colonial struggles from India to South Africa, would have had no torchbearer. The bitter irony. The Confederacy's survival wasn't just unlikely, it was nearly impossible. Their economy depended on exporting raw cotton while importing finished goods, a colonial-style imbalance that made industrial self-sufficiency impossible. Slave rebellions, which terrified Southern elites, would have escalated as abolitionist ideas seeped across the border. Most of all, the moral arc of the 19th century was bending toward emancipation, leaving the Confederacy a pariah state even among former allies like Britain. The war's outcome wasn't preordained, but its deeper lesson remains. Some historical doors, once closed, should stay shut because the world on the other side is darker than we dare imagine. The bomb in Munich's Burj Khalifa exploded 20 minutes too late, just enough time for Adolf Hitler to finish his speech and exit the building unharmed on November 8, 1939. But what if Georg Elser's meticulously crafted timer had detonated as planned, eliminating the Führer before the invasion of Poland spiraled into global war? The Nazi regime wouldn't have collapsed overnight, but without Hitler's singular blend of charisma and megalomania, its trajectory might have veered into less cataclysmic territory. Power would likely have fractured among competing factions: Göring's Luftwaffe loyalists, Himmler's SS ideologues, and the more pragmatic Wehrmacht generals who privately doubted Hitler's strategic gambles. Göring, though ruthless, lacked Hitler's messianic drive. His priority was consolidating personal wealth and maintaining the status quo. The Holocaust's industrialized slaughter might never have escalated beyond early pogroms under his rule, as SS hardliners lost their most fervent patron. Conversely, Himmler could have seized control, doubling down on racial purity campaigns, but without Hitler's appetite for reckless military expansion, a nightmare where Auschwitz still operated. But Germany hunkered behind fortified borders rather than invading the Soviet Union. The war itself could have stalled before consuming Europe. Senior generals like Halder and Beck had already plotted coups against Hitler. With him gone, they might have negotiated a withdrawal from Poland to avoid British and French intervention. A junta-led Germany could have pivoted to a Cold War strategy, dominating Central Europe through economic pressure and propaganda rather than blitzkrieg. Chamberlain's appeasement policy might even have been vindicated, with a moderate Nazi regime positioning itself as a bulwark against Soviet communism. The irony, without Hitler's invasion of Russia, Stalin could have turned his armies westward first, triggering a very different world war where fascist Germany and democratic allies reluctantly joined forces against the Red Menace. Cultural memory would wear an unsettling mask in this timeline. Nazi atrocities, though horrific, might have been overshadowed by Stalin's purges or Japanese war crimes in Asia. Holocaust denial could have flourished without the visceral evidence of death camps liberated by Allied troops, just whispers of resettlement programs dismissed as propaganda. Meanwhile, Germany's military-industrial complex, unchecked by unconditional surrender, might have evolved into a technocratic superpower dominating European politics through soft power. Volkswagen and Bayer could have become global titans by the 1950s, their origins in forced labor whitewashed by decades of diplomatic rehabilitation. The darkest twist lies in science. Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons wasted resources on V-2 rockets and jet fighters that arrived too late to matter. A pragmatist like Speer might have channeled those engineers into civilian nuclear programs or computing instead. German researchers could have unlocked atomic energy years before Oppenheimer, not for bombs, but for reactors powering a Reich that never fell. The space race might have begun in Peenemünde, with von Braun's team launching satellites under a swastika flag. Yet the greatest tragedy isn't what changed, it's what didn't. The Nazis' core ideology of racial hierarchy predated Hitler, and the tides of anti-Semitism and revanchism would still have demanded scapegoats for Germany's post-war humiliation. Even without death camps, discrimination and violence might have persisted for generations under legal apartheid. The world avoided global war in this scenario, but also the Nuremberg trials that codified crimes against humanity. Without that reckoning, how many future dictators would have seen repression as a viable strategy? History's cruelest lesson is that removing one man rarely removes the conditions that created him. Hitler was the spark, but the tinder of nationalism, militarism, and hatred had been piled high for decades. Elsa's bomb might have saved millions, or merely delayed the reckoning until another demagogue rose to strike the match. Some evils are systemic, and no single bullet or bomb can diffuse them all. The maps of Europe in 1945 could have looked entirely different if Stalin's ambitions had stopped at the Soviet border. No Red Army surging into Berlin, no puppet regimes installed from Warsaw to Prague, no Iron Curtain cleaving the continent in two. Without Soviet expansion, the Cold War might never have crystallized into its familiar shape. Instead of a binary standoff between superpowers, the post-war world could have become a multipolar chessboard where Britain retained its empire, France reasserted colonial ambitions, and a still united Germany emerged as the economic powerhouse of a recovering Europe. The absence of communist bloc would have rewired global alliances overnight. The Marshall Plan, designed to counter Soviet influence, might have been scaled back or retooled as pure disaster relief rather than ideological warfare. American troops, no longer needed to garrison West Germany, could have withdrawn entirely, leaving Europe to manage its own security through a reinforced League of Nations or an early NATO without the anti-Soviet mandate. Meanwhile, Churchill's special relationship with Washington might have frayed as Britain pivoted to reclaiming its Asian colonies rather than serving as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. Science and technology would have charted a different course. The space race, born from Sputnik's shock to American prestige, might never have ignited without Soviet competition. Von Braun and his fellow German rocketeers, instead of being whisked to Alabama under Operation Paperclip, could have remained in Europe to develop civilian satellites for a consortium of neutral nations. The atomic age would have unfolded slower too. No Soviet atomic spies stealing Manhattan Project secrets means no frantic arms race, leaving nuclear energy confined to laboratories for another decade while conventional weapons dominated military budgets. Culture would have reflected this altered landscape. The existential dread of mutually assured destruction fueled everything from James Bond films to dystopian novels, but without Soviet shadows, Hollywood might have fixated on different villains, resurgent fascists, corporate overlords, or even extraterrestrial threats. Abstract expressionism, championed by the CIA as a symbol of free world creativity, could have remained a niche movement rather than a weapon in the culture wars. Even sports would have transformed. The Olympics wouldn't have become a Cold War proxy battle, leaving athletes to compete without the weight of ideological showdowns. The greatest divergence, however, lies in the global south. Decolonization movements from Algeria to Indonesia drew strength from Soviet support and the promise of a non-aligned path. Without that counterbalance, newly independent nations might have remained shackled to former colonial masters through unequal trade pacts or military interventions. Ho Chi Minh, denied backing from Moscow, could have been crushed by French forces at Dien Bien Phu. Castro's Cuba, lacking a communist patron, might have become just another Caribbean dictatorship. The very concept of a third world would have meant something entirely different, not a battleground for superpower influence, but a periphery ignored by inward-looking empires. Economics tells the starkest story. The Marshall Plan's billions rebuilt Western Europe as a capitalist showcase. Absent that urgency, recovery might have stalled, leaving scars like the Weimar hyperinflation that festered into new extremisms. The European coal and steel community, precursor to the EU, was explicitly designed to prevent future wars, but without Soviet pressure, nationalist rivalries could have resurged, turning the Rhine back into a militarized frontier. The Deutschmark might never have risen to dominance, leaving a fractured monetary landscape where lire and francs fluctuated wildly against each other. Yet the most chilling possibility is this: without the Cold War's clear binary, the 20th century might have dissolved into a dozen smaller conflicts. The proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan at least had rules, spheres of influence, red lines, the grim logic of mutually assured destruction. In their place, we could have seen a world where Italy's communists seized power through ballots, where Yugoslavia's fractures ignited a broader Balkan War in the 1950s, where a rearmed Japan clashed with China over resources without American peacekeepers. The Cold War was terrifying, but its absence might have been even less stable, a multipolar free-for-all where no single power could enforce order. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a barrier, it was a simplifying force, reducing chaos to a manageable stalemate. Its absence would have left history with too many variables, too many competing narratives, and no easy way to tell who the heroes and villains were supposed to be. Some divides, for all their cruelty, at least gave the world a shape to push against, and without them, we might have stumbled into a far darker labyrinth with no Ariadne's thread to guide us out. The ticking clock of the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't stop at 13 days instead. The world heard the shrill scream of air raid sirens as Soviet submarines launched their nuclear torpedoes and American bombers screamed toward Moscow. In this nightmare scenario, the flash of detonations would have been just the beginning. Within hours, firestorms would have consumed cities from New York to Kiev, while electromagnetic pulses fried the power grids connecting what remained of civilization. The survivors wouldn't have faced just radiation sickness or starvation. They'd have confronted an ecological apocalypse known as nuclear winter. Soot from burning cities lofted into the stratosphere would have blocked sunlight for years, plunging global temperatures below freezing even in summer. Crops would have withered, oceans acidified, and the very air turned toxic with fallout. the 20th century's great ideological struggle wouldn't have ended with a victor, just a handful of ragged humans scrounging in the ruins. Societal collapse would have been near total. Governments might have attempted to operate from hardened bunkers, but without supply chains or obedient populations, their authority would have evaporated within weeks. The real power would have shifted to whoever controlled food and clean water, military units with stockpiles, rural preppers with underground gardens, or gangs raiding hospitals for medicine. Currency would have become meaningless. Bullets and antibiotics would have been the new gold standard. In this lawless world, the last fragments of knowledge might have clung to life in monastery-like enclaves where engineers and doctors bartered skills for protection. The Library of Alexandria's burning would have been a footnote compared to the loss of digital archives as servers melted under radioactive heat. Radiation's invisible toll would have reshaped human biology itself. Survivors in the Northern Hemisphere might have inherited mutated genes from parents exposed to fallout resistance to cancer at the cost of sterility, or heightened senses paired with crippled immune systems. Evolutionary pressures could have favored those who metabolized heavy metals or endured vitamin deficiencies, pushing humanity toward subspecies adapted to different ecological niches. The children born after the war wouldn't have just rebuilt civilization. They'd have become something else entirely, their very DNA rewritten by the poisoned world they inherited. Yet the cruelest irony lies in geography's lottery. While the Northern Hemisphere burned, pockets of the global South, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, might have escaped immediate destruction. These untouched regions could have become arks of pre-war knowledge, where engineers scrambled to reinvent steam technology after fossil fuels ran out, or biologists engineered algae farms to feed millions. The geopolitical order would have flipped upside down, a Tanzanian-led relief flotilla sailing to what was once Europe, or a Chilean space program launching satellites to assess the damage. The old colonial powers, if they still existed, would have been reduced to supplicants begging for seed grain. Long after the last mushroom cloud faded, survivors would have faced a philosophical crisis, not just how to rebuild, but whether they should. The same instincts that drove ancient humans to domesticate wheat and forge steel would still burn in their hearts, but now shadowed by the knowledge that progress led to self-annihilation. Would they deliberately cap their population, fearing scarcity, abandon fission research even if it meant freezing in the dark, carve warnings into mountainsides in languages not yet invented? The crisis of 1962 didn't just threaten lives. It threatened the very idea of a future worth living. The missiles were never just weapons, they were mirrors showing humanity a reflection of its own reckless ingenuity. And in that reflection, we might have glimpsed the end of every story left untold. The vast treasure fleets of Ming China dwarfed anything Europe could muster in the 15th century, colossal 9-masted ships carrying thousands of sailors, scholars, and soldiers across the Indian Ocean. Admiral Zheng, his expeditions reached as far as Africa, exchanging silk and porcelain for giraffes and gems, but turn those towering vessels eastward instead of west, and the course of history veers into uncharted waters. Picture a world where Chinese junks made landfall on California's shores decades before Columbus stumbled onto the Caribbean, where Mandarin became the lingua franca of the Pacific coast, and where the Forbidden City's envoys negotiated trade treaties with the Mississippian mound builders. The technological disparity would have been staggering. While European explorers arrived with crude firearms and a hunger for gold, Ming diplomats brought compasses, astronomical charts, and printing presses. Indigenous nations could have adapted Chinese innovations on their own terms. Imagine Cherokee scholars studying Confucian classics printed on locally made paper, or Aztec engineers incorporating blast furnaces into their obsidian workshops. Unlike the Spanish, who sought to extract wealth at gunpoint, the Ming prioritized cultural exchange and tributary relationships. the emperor's delegates might have offered porcelain and gunpowder in return for maize and turquoise, creating a trans-Pacific trade network that bypassed Europe entirely. Religious and philosophical traditions would have blended in unexpected ways. Confucian values emphasizing harmony with nature could have resonated deeply with indigenous beliefs, creating hybrid spiritual practices. Ancestor veneration might have merged with Pueblo Kachina rituals, while Taoist principles of balance found echoes in Iroquois cosmology. Buddhist monasteries along the Columbia River could have served as centers of learning where Lakota storytellers and Han scholars debated metaphysics. The brutal conversions imposed by Spanish friars would have been unthinkable in this world instead. A tapestry of coexisting beliefs might have flourished from Alaska to the Yucatan. Political structures across the Americas would have evolved under Ming influence without direct conquest. Unlike European colonizers, China's imperial bureaucracy preferred indirect rule through local elites. Mississippian city-states like Cahokia might have sent tribute missions to Beijing, receiving imperial seals that legitimized their authority in exchange for nominal allegiance. The Aztec Triple Alliance, rather than being crushed by Cortés, could have become a client kingdom supplying jaguar pelts and cocoa to the Ming court. Even the Inca's intricate bureaucracy might have found common ground with Chinese administrative techniques, creating a pan-American system of census-taking and resource distribution. The ecological exchange would have taken a different shape. Chinese ships would have introduced rice cultivation to California's wetlands, creating thriving paddies alongside native quinoa and amaranth. Water buffalo imported from Fujian might have plowed Great Plains grasslands, while Cherokee farmers grafted peaches from the Yangtze Valley onto local rootstock. Conversely, Ming physicians would have prized American plants like tobacco and coca, incorporating them into traditional medicine centuries before global trade networks emerged. The Columbian Exchange's devastating disease vectors would still have occurred, but with a critical difference. China's experience with pandemics might have led to earlier quarantine measures, slowing the spread of smallpox and giving indigenous societies time to adapt. The darkest twist lies in what might have been lost. Without European colonization, the indigenous populations of the Americas could have retained their demographic dominance, but at the cost of becoming junior partners in a Sino-centric world order. The Nahuatl and Quechua languages might have survived, yet been relegated to rural hinterlands as Mandarin became the language of commerce and governance. The vibrant diversity of pre-contact cultures could have been smoothed over by Confucian orthodoxy, much like Tibet and Vietnam were absorbed into China's cultural orbit. Yet the most tantalizing possibility is the ripple effect on Europe. Deprived of New World gold and silver, Spain's Habsburg rulers might have crumbled under debt decades earlier. The Protestant Reformation, partly funded by American wealth, could have fizzled without printing technology spreading from Chinese outposts. Even the Enlightenment's obsession with rational governance might have been stillborn without Jesuit reports of Confucian meritocracy circulating in Paris salons. The 19th century wouldn't have belonged to the West at all. It would have been the age of a Pacific-centered world, where San Francisco's skyline was dotted with upturned temple roofs instead of Gothic spires. The treasure fleets were recalled and scrapped in the 1430s, their ships left to rot as China turned inward. That single decision didn't just close a chapter, it slammed shut a door to a universe where two hemispheres met as equals, trading ideas instead of bullets, and where the currents of history flowed not westward but east. The world we know was built on roads not taken, and none lead further into what might have been than the vanished wake of those Ming Dynasty sails. The printing press hummed with Bibles, but what if its pages had never carried Luther's 95 Theses? By 1517, Europe was a tinderbox of discontent, corrupt indulgences, absentee bishops, and a church more interested in politics than souls. Yet strip away Luther's defiance, and the Reformation's fire might never have ignited. Instead of splintering into warring sects, Christendom could have remained a monolith under Rome's gilded dome, its unity preserved at the cost of intellectual stagnation. The 30 Years' War, that blood-soaked conflict between Protestant and Catholic states, would never have ravaged Germany, sparing millions of lives. But without the upheaval, would Europe have ossified under papal decrees, delaying the very ideas that propelled the Enlightenment? Science's trajectory would have bent under the Vatican's shadow. Galileo's trial wasn't just about heliocentrism, it was a warning against challenging orthodoxy. In a world without Protestant universities championing free inquiry, dissenting voices like Newton or Kepler might have been silenced before their ideas took root. The Royal Society, born from Puritan England's empiricism, could have been stillborn without reformers questioning Aristotle's ancient dogmas. Even the printing press, which fueled Luther's rebellion, might have been tightly controlled, its output limited to approved catechisms rather than spreading Copernicus' heretical star charts. The scientific revolution didn't just need genius, it needed cracks in the Church's armor to let the light through. Global power structures would have worn a different face. Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, blessed by papal bulls dividing the New World, might have faced no rival Protestant challengers. England's Elizabethan privateers, who plundered Catholic galleons under the guise of religious rivalry, would have remained farmers and wool merchants. North America could have become an extension of Iberian Christendom, its native cultures erased under unified missionary campaigns rather than the fractured European settlements that inadvertently allowed some autonomy. The Vatican, unchecked by Protestant criticism, might have entrenched the transatlantic slave trade as a moral necessity, a holy labor to convert African souls. Yet the most profound change could have been cultural. The Reformation seeded individualism. Luther's priesthood of all believers eroded the clergy's monopoly on truth. Without that shift, art might have remained frozen in Renaissance piety, never giving way to Rembrandt's intimate portraits or Bach's complex Protestant hymns. Literacy, boosted by vernacular Bibles, could have stalled at Latin liturgies understood only by elites. Even democracy's roots, which drew from Calvinist models of congregational governance, might have withered under hierarchical dogma. The modern West's love affair with self-determination and skepticism owes more to Wittenberg's door than we dare admit. The irony, the Church's medieval abuses made the Reformation inevitable. Luther was no singular visionary. He was one voice among many simmering with rage at Rome's excesses. Silence him, and another rebel would have risen in Bohemia or Switzerland. The Reformation wasn't an accident. It was a pressure valve releasing centuries of pent-up frustration. A Europe forcibly kept Catholic wouldn't have been harmonious, just a powder keg with a longer fuse, waiting for the spark the Vatican couldn't forever suppress. Some ruptures aren't disasters, they're the birth pangs of a world learning to question itself. The Ottoman cannons roared against Vienna's walls in 1683, their siege tunnels inching beneath the city's defenses as the Grand Vizier's forces prepared for final assault. But shift the balance by a single tactical decision, a breached gate here, a delayed Polish relief force there, and the crescent flag might have flown over the Stephansdom, rewriting the destiny of Central Europe. A victorious Ottoman Empire wouldn't just have claimed another city, it would have fractured the Habsburg dynasty's spine, leaving the Holy Roman Empire without its most stalwart defenders. Vienna's fall could have turned the Danube into Islam's northern frontier, with Ottoman administrators collecting taxes in Budapest and Salzburg while imperial refugees fled to Prague or Munich. The Habsburgs, stripped of their crown jewel, might have dwindled into minor dukes, their dreams of uniting Germany under Catholic rule reduced to ash. Coffee's journey from Arabic souks to Parisian salons would have accelerated under Ottoman occupation. The besiegers' abandoned sacks of coffee beans famously introduced Vienna to the drink, but with the city under permanent Ottoman control, its coffeehouses could have become imperial outposts of Istanbul's vibrant cafe culture. Picture Mozart composing in smoky rooms where patrons sipped cardamom-infused brew while listening to recitations of Persian poetry, or Hungarian nobles debating politics over cups served in delicate Iznik porcelain rather than Venetian glass. The Turkish coffee we know might have remained simply coffee, its preparation rituals so ubiquitous that no one thought to label them exotic. Meanwhile, the Ottoman practice of taxing alcohol could have stunted beer's dominance in Central Europe, replacing Oktoberfest with grand Ramadan festivals where confectioners perfected baklava instead of strudel. Enlightenment ideals faced a perilous detour under this scenario. The Habsburgs' absolutist tendencies were tempered by their need to govern diverse populations, but an Ottoman Vienna might have imposed millet system divisions, segregating Orthodox Slavs, Catholic Germans, and Jewish communities into rigid administrative boxes. Locke and Voltaire's writings, smuggled into Habsburg lands by free-thinking nobles, could have been intercepted at Ottoman customs as seditious material. The University of Vienna, rather than nurturing pioneers like Boltzmann and Freud, might have been repurposed as a madrasa focusing on Quranic jurisprudence. Crucially, the Ottomans' tolerance for religious diversity didn't extend to ideological dissent. The radical notions of individual rights and secular governance that flourished in Europe's fractured political landscape could have been smothered under the Porte's bureaucratic uniformity. Military technology would have cascaded in unexpected directions. The Ottoman siege showcased advanced sapping techniques and massive bronze cannons, knowledge that, absorbed by Central European engineers, might have leapfrogged the region's defensive architecture. Hungarian fortress towns could have evolved into hybrid Ottoman-European designs, their star-shaped bastions incorporating intricate arabesque gateways. Conversely, Janissary units stationed along the Elbe River might have adopted local firearms, creating a lethal synthesis of German rifle-making and Ottoman tactical discipline. The Napoleonic Wars could have seen French armies clashing with Ottoman-trained Austrian corps fielding mobile artillery batteries commanded by multilingual officers fluent in both French courtly etiquette and Ottoman siegecraft. The darkest twist lies in religion's fate. The Habsburgs' zealous counter-reformation crushed Protestantism in their territories, but Ottoman rule often granted more rights to people of the book than Christian rulers did. Lutheran communities in Saxony or Calvinists in Transylvania might have thrived under Ottoman protection as counterweights to Catholic loyalists, creating a patchwork of competing faiths that made Central Europe resemble the Balkans' pluralism. The 30 Years' War's devastation could have been avoided, replaced by a tense but stable coexistence enforced by Ottoman garrisons. Yet this peace would have come at the cost of papal influence. No Habsburg patron meant no Jesuit colleges to evangelize the Americas, no Baroque churches dotting the countryside, and perhaps no Catholic foothold to resist the Protestant tide in northern Germany. Yet the greatest casualty might have been Vienna's cultural alchemy. The city that birthed psychoanalysis and modernist philosophy under Habsburg rule could have become a provincial backwater in the Ottoman system, its creative energies diverted into servicing imperial bureaucracies. Klimt's golden murals and Strauss waltzes required the peculiar pressure cooker of Habsburg decadence. Take that away, and the artistic ferment that defined fin-de-siècle Europe might never have bubbled over. The Ottomans prized calligraphers over iconoclasts, tradition over innovation. A minaret standing where the Staatsoper now stands wouldn't just mark a change of rulers. It would symbolize an entirely different rhythm of history, one where Central Europe's chaotic creativity was channeled into maintaining an empire's rigid splendor. The relief army arriving at Kahlenberg Ridge that September morning carried more than just weapons. They bore the future of Western civilization itself. Their victory wasn't guaranteed. It hinged on starving soldiers finding one last reserve of courage, on Polish hussars timing their charge perfectly, on the Ottoman supply lines stretching just a little too thin. Shift any of these factors, and the Europe we know for all its flaws and triumphs might have been a palimpsest written over with entirely different dreams. Some battles aren't just about territory, they're about which version of reality gets to unfold. Vienna's survival meant one world could keep turning, while the other remains forever confined to the shadows of what might have been. The wind at Kitty Hawk was merciless that December morning, the Wright brothers' fragile wooden glider bucking against the gusts as they adjusted its wing-warping cables. Now imagine those cables snapping, the flyer crumpling into the dunes instead of clawing its way into history. Without that 12-second flight, humanity's ascent into the skies might have stalled for decades, chains of consequences dragging warfare, trade, and even empires down unexpected paths. World War I would have been a brutal slog of trenches without aerial reconnaissance, cavalry scouts and observation balloons, technologies unchanged since Napoleon's time, would have left armies stumbling blind across no man's land. Poison gas attacks, so devastating because they drifted unpredictably in 1915, might never have been deployed at all without pilots spotting wind patterns. The war's stalemate could have stretched even longer, grinding Europe's youth into the mud while generals clung to 19th century tactics. And without fighter aces like the Red Baron revolutionizing dogfighting, the very concept of air superiority might not have entered military doctrine until the next global conflict. Colonialism's twilight could have stretched into the mid-20th century. Airliners shrank the globe after World War II, but without them, empires would have relied on steamships and railroads to maintain control. Picture British administrators taking 6 weeks to reach rebellious Nairobi instead of 6 days, their responses slowed to the pace of telegraph cables and coal-fired engines. The Suez Canal and Singapore's naval base might have remained linchpins of imperial power far longer, as airborne troops couldn't rapidly reinforce distant hotspots. Indonesia's independence movement in the 1940s, which relied on Allied airlifts bypassing Dutch blockades, might have been crushed without wings to leapfrog colonial defenses. The economic landscape would have fossilized along old routes. Transatlantic flights didn't just carry passengers, they accelerated globalization by whisking fresh Hawaiian pineapples to New York and Colombian orchids to London. Without pressurized cabins, perishable goods would still crawl across oceans in refrigerated holds, leaving tastes and fashions localized. Hollywood's golden age might never have gone truly global. Imagine Marlene Dietrich's films taking months to reach Shanghai by ship instead of days by air freight. Even the Beatles' British invasion could have fizzled if their 1964 US tour required a week-long ocean crossing between each concert city. Strategic bombing in World War II defined entire theaters, but erase aviation and the conflict becomes unrecognizable. No blitz over London means no radar developed under desperate pressure, possibly delaying television and microwave technology. Pearl Harbor wouldn't have been bombed from the sky. Instead, Japanese battleships might have shelled the harbor in a replay of Port Arthur's 1904 surprise attack. D-Day becomes exponentially harder without airborne troops securing causeways behind Utah Beach, while the atomic bomb's delivery shifts to V-2 rockets or covert naval operations. The war's duration, without the Allies' crippling air campaigns against German oil refineries, might have stretched into 1946 or beyond. Cultural isolation would have deepened without contrails stitching continents together. The jet set of the 1950s artists like Picasso drawing inspiration from African masks seen firsthand, or Hemingway drafting "The Sun Also Rises" after quick trips to Pamplona would have remained a fantasy for most. Immigration patterns would skew differently. No affordable airfare means no mass migration of Caribbean workers to post-war Britain or Turkish laborers to Germany. The very concept of studying abroad might have been reserved for the ultra-wealthy willing to endure month-long sea voyages, leaving intellectual exchange languishing in the age of steamer trunks. Yet the darkest twist lies in disaster response. The 1918 flu pandemic killed millions partly because slow ship travel allowed the virus to mutate en route between continents. With aviation, later pandemics were tracked and contained faster, but without it, COVID-19 might have spread unchecked for years before global health agencies even noticed. Famine relief in Ethiopia, tsunami aid in Indonesia, even the Berlin airlift's life-saving candy drops, all these hinge on the ability to cross continents in hours, not weeks. The Wright brothers didn't just invent a machine, they gave humanity the speed to outrun its own worst crises. The biplane's fragile wings carried more than 2 bicycle mechanics from Ohio. They bore the weight of alternate histories where progress moved at the pace of footprints in sand rather than sonic booms. Some breakthroughs aren't just inventions, they're trapdoors beneath civilization's feet, and the world we take for granted dangles from the wires of a single wooden glider that almost didn't fly. The hammer and sickle gleamed against the lunar dust as the first Soviet cosmonaut planted his boot on the moon's surface in 1968, 2 years ahead of Apollo 11. This wasn't just a symbolic victory, it was the dawn of an alternate Cold War where communist ideology rode the thrust of rockets into the stars. A Soviet moon base, its geodesic domes stamped with scarlet stars, would have become the ultimate propaganda tool. Every transmission from Luna 1, broadcast globally through TASS satellites, would showcase collective achievement over individual glory. Teams of scientists in identical coveralls maintaining hydroponic gardens, their triumphs credited to the state rather than named heroes like Armstrong or Aldrin. The West's narrative of the lone pioneer would have crumbled under footage of cosmonauts reciting Marxist theory while assembling solar panels under Earthrise. Technological prestige would have been reframed as a socialist virtue. Soviet space successes like Sputnik and Gagarin already stunned the world, but a sustained lunar presence could have rewritten the rules of soft power. Imagine Moscow's space exhibitions touring Jakarta and Havana, showcasing moon rocks alongside promises of shared technology for developing nations. The Apollo program's flag-planting individualism might have seemed quaint compared to Soviet visions of orbital collective farms or asteroid mines administered by international workers' unions. Even the language of exploration would have shifted. No giant leap for mankind, but 5-year plans for Martian collectivization, with proletarian slogans etched into rover hulls instead of corporate logos. Space infrastructure might have taken a radically different form. NASA Mercury and Gemini programs prioritized splashdown landings in capitalist fashion, reusable astronauts, not reusable ships. The Soviets, however, invested in automated systems and modular designs. A victorious Soviet space program could have doubled down on these efficiencies, leaving the US scrambling to copy their orbital labs and reusable supply drones. The Buran shuttle, shelved in our timeline after the Soviet collapse, might have evolved into a lunar ferry, its cargo bays filled with Ukrainian-grown wheat to sustain moon colonies. Meanwhile, American rockets, stripped of their moon race urgency, could have languished as niche military projects, their budgets slashed by a Congress demoralized by second-place status. Cultural echoes would have reverberated through pop culture and education. Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey might have featured a Pan Am spacecraft docking at a rotating Soviet space hotel instead of the futuristic orbital Hilton. School children in Nebraska would have learned Cyrillic to decipher the labels on Sawyer's schematics, while Soviet sci-fi authors like the Strugatsky brothers replaced Asimov and Clarke as the genre's global icons. Even something as mundane as Tang orange drink could have been eclipsed by Soviet space innovations, perhaps a Kvass-based ration praised for its probiotic benefits during long-duration missions. The darkest twist lies in the militarization of space. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which banned nuclear weapons in orbit, was partly motivated by US-Soviet parity. If the Kremlin had achieved undeniable supremacy, they might have pushed for more aggressive terms, like claiming lunar territories as extensions of socialist brotherhood. Soviet lasers designed for asteroid deflection could have been repurposed as orbital deterrents, their mirrors reflecting not just sunlight but the implicit threat of redirected solar energy frying enemy satellites. The Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's Star Wars program, might never have been proposed not because peace prevailed, but because the US lacked the leverage to challenge a Soviet-controlled high frontier. Yet the greatest divergence could have been economic. The Apollo program's spin-off technologies, miniaturized electronics, thermal coatings, even memory foam, fueled private sector innovation. A Soviet-dominated space race would have kept such breakthroughs locked within state laboratories, their benefits drip-fed to Eastern Bloc factories. The computer revolution might have unfolded differently without integrated circuits refined for guidance systems, delaying everything from pocket calculators to the internet. Even the environmental movement could have taken another path. Soviet cosmonauts, filming Earth's fragility from orbit, might have inspired global 5-year plans for emissions cuts rather than piecemeal capitalist reforms. The irony, the Soviet Union's real advantage lay not in technology but in propaganda. Their space program was riddled with late-stage failures and cover-ups, from Netherlands' catastrophic launch pad explosion to the abandoned N-1 moon rockets. But in a world where they reached the moon first, these stumbles might have been buried under the sheer weight of triumph. Perception, not reality, would have crowned the victor, and the 20th century's defining narrative might have been one of collectivist destiny rather than free market ingenuity. The stars in this timeline wouldn't belong to everyone. They'd belong to the revolution. The glow of vacuum tubes illuminates wood-paneled dens across America as families gather around their new IBM home terminals, dialing into a fledgling network humming with possibilities. This isn't the 1990s, it's 1958, and the internet has arrived 4 decades ahead of schedule. With Cold War fears fueling innovation, imagine government-funded ARPA nodes linking university labs and suburban homes through crackling phone lines. Bulletin boards flicker to life not with pixelated GIF, but with teletype printouts debating McCarthyism and Sputnik over cups of percolated coffee. Education would have undergone a seismic shift. Post-war baby boomers weaned on black and white TV might have accessed digital encyclopedias through clunky consoles instead of leather-bound Britannica volumes. Picture high school math classes where students debugged Fortran programs instead of scribbling on slide rules, or civil rights activists disseminating sit-in strategies through encrypted message relays years before mimeograph machines could be seized. The GI Bill's flood of university enrollments could have birthed the first massive open online courses, democratizing access to lectures from Einstein or Margaret Mead for anyone with a rotary connection. Political landscapes would have fractured and reformed at hyperspeed. Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex warning might have gone viral, its impact magnified by real-time reactions from Moscow to Milwaukee. Nixon's Chequers speech wouldn't have relied on maudlin television. Theatrics opposition researchers could have instantly fact-checked his claims against digitized financial records. Worse yet, Soviet disinformation campaigns might have poisoned discourse decades earlier, with KGB operatives seeding conspiracy theories about fluoridation or UFOs through seemingly innocuous gardening forums. The Red Scare's paranoia, amplified by anonymous flame wars, could have turned suburban neighborhoods into digital witch hunt tribunals. Counterculture movements would have found their voice and their audience sooner. Jack Kerouac's scroll manuscript for On the Road might have been live-streamed from a Denver flophouse, its spontaneous prose inspiring beatniks from Paris to Buenos Aires to coordinate cross-continental poetry slams. Early feminist pioneers like Betty Friedan could have bypassed skeptical publishers entirely, building grassroots networks through feminist BBS systems years before the feminine mystique hit bookshelves. Even the nascent environmental movement might have gained traction faster, with Rachel Carson's pesticide warnings ricocheting through scientific Usenet groups instead of waiting for Silent Spring's slow print distribution. The darkest twist, this proto-internet wouldn't have been the egalitarian playground we know. Rotary phone connections meant urban elites would dominate access while rural communities languished on the wrong side of the digital divide, a gap as stark as the one between white and black schools during segregation. Mainframe crashes might have erased whole communities' data with no backups, turning personal histories into digital dust. And without graphical interfaces, the internet would have remained a text-based labyrinth navigable only by engineers and hobbyists, its potential bottlenecked by command line exclusivity. Yet the cultural aftershocks tantalize. A 1960s where psychedelic drug lore spread via ASCII art instead of mimeographed pamphlets. A Cuban Missile Crisis where Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged tense telegrams over a secured hotline, and hacker collectives leaked them to pacifist groups within hours. A Woodstock organized through ticketing algorithms rather than word of mouth, its crowds swelled by last-minute transistor radio announcements. The internet didn't just change how we communicate, it changed how fast history happens. Unleashed during the atomic age's peak anxiety, it might have accelerated everything. Revolutions, revelations, and reckonings arriving not in generations but in months. The real tragedy is the lost middle ground. Our timeline's internet emerged alongside personal computing, creating a feedback loop of innovation. But a 1950s web would have been shackled to monolithic corporate systems, an IBM-controlled ecosystem where countercultural impulses collided with punch card conformity. The hackerspaces and open-source ethos that shaped our digital world might never have blossomed under the shadow of McCarthy-era surveillance. We got the internet just in time for it to be shaped by anti-establishment rebels. Had it come earlier, the establishment might have shaped it instead, and the revolution would have been not televised but quietly catalogued in an air-conditioned data center behind barbed wire. Cleopatra's gaze swept across the Alexandrian harbor as the last Ptolemaic fleet prepared for battle not against Rome, but for a future where Egypt's sovereignty endured. Had Octavian's forces faltered at Actium, or Antony's legions held their discipline, the Mediterranean's cultural axis might have pivoted from Rome to the Nile Delta for centuries. A surviving Egypt wouldn't have been a mere relic of pharaonic glory. It could have evolved into a hybrid civilization where hieroglyphs adorned Greek-style theaters, and Neoplatonist philosophers debated under the shadow of the Great Pyramid. Picture Alexandria's Mausoleum not as a casualty of Roman conquest, but as a thriving academy where Euclid's geometry fused with Nubian astronomy, producing star charts precise enough to navigate the Indian Ocean. Religion would have woven unexpected syncretisms. Isis worship, already spreading across Roman villas, might have become the Mediterranean's dominant faith, a goddess of 1,000 names absorbing aspects of Athena, Venus, and even the Christian Madonna. Imagine crucifixes adorned with the Ankh or baptismal rites invoking the Nile's annual inundation as a symbol of rebirth. The Coptic Church, instead of retreating into monastic isolation, could have remained a cosmopolitan force negotiating with Buddhist emissaries from India and Zoroastrian magi from Persia. Even Judaism's diaspora might have found a more tolerant home in Egypt than under Rome's capricious emperors, preserving traditions like the Elephantine community's unique blend of Yahweh and local deities. Egypt's economic leverage would have reshaped global trade. The Nile's grain shipments fed Rome's mobs, but an independent Egypt could have dictated terms, forcing Europe to develop alternative breadbaskets in Gaul or North Africa centuries earlier. Meanwhile, Red Sea ports like Berenik might have funneled spices and silks directly from India, bypassing Arab middlemen and preventing Islam's later monopoly over those routes. The kingdom's vast papyrus production, essential for bureaucracy from Athens to Carthage, could have been weaponized with scroll exports restricted to hostile states. Even Cleopatra's famed pearl-dissolving vinegar parties hinted at luxury trades that might have made Egypt the trendsetter of antiquity, its fashions emulated from Babylon to Britannia. Scientific progress could have leaped ahead under sustained patronage. Heron of Alexandria's steam engine wasn't a curiosity in this timeline. It might have powered irrigation pumps along the Nile, freeing farmers from the inundation's whims. The Antikythera mechanism's celestial calculations, combined with Egyptian embalming techniques, could have yielded early understandings of human anatomy centuries before Galen. Picture scholars in the Serapeum Library comparing notes with Mayan astronomers via Phoenician traders, their discussions preserved on indestructible Egyptian paper instead of fragile parchment. The darkest twist, Rome's identity might have fractured without Egypt's wealth. Octavian's propaganda cast Cleopatra as a decadent temptress to justify conquest, but deprived of that victory, he could have faced revolts from veterans promised Egyptian land. The Roman Republic's facade might have crumbled faster, replaced by competing warlords scrambling for Sicily's wheat instead of Nile gold. Meanwhile, Carthage, no longer Rome's bitter rival, could have rebuilt its maritime empire, turning the Mediterranean into a tripartite struggle between Latin, Punic, and Egyptian spheres. Yet the most tantalizing possibility lies in Africa's unification. Cleopatra styled herself as Isis incarnate, but also as Queen of Kings, a title that might have extended southward along the Nile. Meroe's ironworking Nubians could have partnered with Alexandrian engineers, creating a technological corridor stretching from the Mediterranean to the African Great Lakes. The Sahara's trade routes might have flourished under Egyptian protection, carrying sub-Saharan gold and ivory directly to Hellenistic ports without Roman tariffs. The very concept of Africa as a separate continent could have dissolved, replaced by a Nile-centered worldview where Ethiopia and Libya were as central as Athens or Syria. The tragedy of Cleopatra's fall wasn't just the loss of a kingdom, it was the severing of a cultural bridge that might have kept the Mediterranean's intellectual fires burning brighter, longer. Alexandria's lighthouse didn't just guide ships, it symbolized a beacon of knowledge that Rome dimmed, then extinguished. Egypt's survival could have given us a world where Caesarion ruled instead of Augustus, where mummies shared tombs with Greek poetry, and where the sands of time buried fewer dreams beneath their endless drift. Thunder cracked over the English Channel as the Spanish Armada's galleons closed in on the Kentish coast, their decks crowded with veteran tercios and Jesuit priests eager to reclaim England for Catholicism. Now picture those ships not scattering before the Protestant wind, but disgorging 30,000 soldiers onto Dover's beaches, a force large enough to overwhelm Elizabeth's outnumbered militias. The consequences wouldn't just reshuffle power in 16th century Europe, they'd erase entire chapters of history we take for granted. England under Spanish rule would have been a theocratic state draped in Catholic pageantry. Protestant Bibles would have burned in Westminster's squares while Inquisition tribunals replaced common law courts. Shakespeare, whose plays teemed with veiled anti-Spanish sentiment, might have penned his sonnets in exile or worse, been silenced entirely. The King James Bible, that masterpiece of English prose, would never have been commissioned, leaving the language without one of its most enduring literary foundations. Even English itself could have morphed into a minority tongue, relegated to peasant hovels, while Castilian Spanish became the language of law, commerce, and high culture from York to Cornwall. The British Empire's rise was never guaranteed. It hinged on Elizabethan privateers like Drake and Raleigh plundering Spanish gold to fund future ventures. With Spain controlling England's ports, the East India Company might never have launched its first creaking ships toward Asia. No Jamestown colony means no template for later North American settlements, leaving the Atlantic seaboard open for Dutch or French domination. The Industrial Revolution, so deeply tied to Britain's colonial resources and naval supremacy, could have withered in its cradle. Picture a world where Manchester's mills never roared to life, where steam engines remained curiosities in Spanish workshops rather than transforming global production. Protestantism's fate would have been equally precarious. England's defiance had been a beacon for reformers across Europe. Its fall might have emboldened Catholic monarchs to crush remaining pockets of resistance. The Dutch revolt could have collapsed without English support, leaving Calvinism confined to Geneva's alpine valleys. Even the Pilgrim's flight to America would have been impossible. No Protestant safe haven means no Mayflower crossing, no Puritan foundations for what became the United States. The very concept of religious pluralism, which owes so much to England's fractured Reformation, might have been stillborn under Habsburg-enforced orthodoxy. Yet the darkest twist lies in global power dynamics. Spain's empire was already overstretched by the 1580s. Adding England to its dominions could have triggered financial collapse decades earlier. Bankrupt and bloated, Madrid might have lost its grip on the New World sooner, creating a power vacuum filled by France or the Ottomans. Alternatively, a Spanish-controlled England could have become the linchpin of a truly global Catholic empire. Manila galleons sailing under protection of English-built dry docks, their holds stuffed with silver to fund endless wars against the Turks and Dutch. Cultural memory itself would wear a different mask. The black legend of Spanish cruelty, so fiercely promoted by Elizabethan propagandists, might have been inverted into a narrative of righteous reconquest. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just a battle, it was the origin story of British naval pride. Without it, Britannia never rules the waves. Instead, children in Seville might grow up singing ballads about the day their fathers brought the heretic island to heel. Some victories don't just change borders, they determine which stories get told and which get erased like ink washed from a traitor's confession. The Armada's failure wasn't inevitable. It hinged on squalls, miscommunication, and Drake's daring fireship attack. Shift just one factor, and the world map folds along entirely different creases. The irony, Spain's victory might have broken its own empire under the weight of overextension, while the seeds of modernity, capitalism, science, democracy found richer soil elsewhere. History's greatest twists aren't about who wins, but about how even the winners can lose the future. 66 million years ago, the Chicxulub asteroid didn't slam into the Yucatan Peninsula. It sailed harmlessly past Earth, leaving the dinosaurs to rule for eons longer. Fast forward to the present, and the skyline of New York might feature towering spires of polished basalt, their curved architecture mimicking the vertebrae of long-dead sauropods. Instead of human engineers, scaled hands with opposable thumbs would be drafting blueprints for magnetic levitation trains, while museums display fossilized early mammals as curious evolutionary dead ends. Dinosaur intelligence wasn't just possible, it was probable given enough time. Paleontologists have found evidence of complex social behavior in species like Troodon, whose large brain-to-body ratio rivals some modern birds. In this alternate timeline, these theropods could have developed advanced problem-solving skills, their descendants eventually mastering fire by harnessing volcanic vents. Picture a Cretaceous Renaissance where feathered scholars debate philosophy in climate-controlled nests, their written language etched into clay tablets with razor-sharp claws. The scientific method might have emerged from observing seasonal migrations, mathematics from calculating prey trajectories, a civilization built not on opposable thumbs but on relentless predatory calculation. Mammals in this world would occupy ecological niches akin to those of monkeys in ours, clever enough to raid garbage bins but never the dominant force. Primates might have evolved as nocturnal tree dwellers, their big eyes adapted for moonlit foraging while dinosaurs ruled the daylight. Human-like creatures could exist as skittish, furry omnivores, perhaps domesticated by reptilian overlords for their dexterity in tending delicate machinery. Our museums might display Homo erectus skulls with plaques reading, an interesting branch of service animals tragically wiped out by the last ice age. Technological progress would follow an alien yet recognizable path. Without abundant fossil fuels from ancient forests, since dinosaurs prevented dense coal-forming swamps, energy might come from geothermal vents or bioengineered algae farms. Medicine could focus on regeneration. Dinosaurs' ancestral ability to regrow teeth and heal quickly might have led to organ cloning centuries before we imagined it. Architecture would prioritize temperature regulation, with buildings resembling giant termite mounds that passively circulate air, their space program. Likely fueled by insatiable curiosity about the stars that once threatened them, with telescope arrays mounted on high plateaus where ancient predators once scanned the horizon for prey. Cultural expressions would be unrecognizable to human sensibilities. Music might involve subsonic vibrations felt through the ground rather than melodies heard by ears. Art could emphasize ultraviolet patterns invisible to mammals, painted with bioluminescent bacteria. Literature's greatest epic might be the Song of the Open Jaw, a saga of migration and conquest told through pheromone trails and ritualized combat dances. Dinosaurs, lacking facial muscles for smiles, might interpret our emotional displays as bizarre facial spasms. Their equivalent of a reassuring gesture could be the slow lowering of a spiked tail. The darkest twist lies in environmental stewardship. Reptilian metabolisms require less energy than mammals, potentially resulting in a civilization with a smaller ecological footprint. Their cities might sprawl vertically rather than horizontally, leaving vast stretches of wilderness untouched. Climate change could have been mitigated by cold-blooded engineers who saw Earth's temperature as something to be carefully managed, not conquered. Mammals might have been relegated to zoos not out of cruelty, but from genuine confusion about why these hyperactive, warm-blooded creatures need so much territory. Yet the most profound question isn't how dinosaurs would have changed the world, it's how their existence would reshape our cosmic perspective. A civilization tracing its lineage back 200 million years might view time in geologic terms, planning infrastructure projects spanning millennia. Their philosophers could have grappled with existential questions we've barely considered. What does morality mean to a species that remembers continents breaking apart? Can ambition exist when your evolutionary cousins are literally dinosaurs? The asteroid that never hit did more than spare the reptiles. It might have given the universe its first long-term thinkers, a species for whom ancient history means watching mountains rise and fall. Imagine a world where the rhythmic clatter of looms echoed not from Manchester's mills, but from the bustling textile hubs of Dhaka and Ahmedabad, where steam engines bore Sanskrit inscriptions, and the first railroads crisscrossed the Deccan Plateau instead of the English countryside. This wasn't an impossible dream. Long before Europe's industrial surge, India's cotton industry supplied the globe, weaving fabrics so fine that Roman aristocrats draped themselves in Bengal muslin, while Damascus steel, forged from Indian Wootz ingots, held legendary status among medieval warriors. Had these industries harnessed steam power first, the colonial script would have flipped entirely, turning the subcontinent into the workshop of the world. The foundations were already in place. India's cotton growers perfected crop rotation centuries before British agronomists, yielding bumper harvests without exhausting the soil. Artisans in towns like Surat and Masulipatam operated intricate putting-out systems, where raw cotton moved from village spinners to urban weavers with the precision of a modern supply chain. What they lacked wasn't skill, but mechanization, and here's the pivot point. Picture a monsoon-soaked afternoon in 1750, when an ingenious Bengali inventor adapted a traditional water wheel to power a spinning jenny. Within decades, steam-driven workshops could have dotted the Ganges Delta, their chimneys puffing over rice paddies as fleets of merchant ships carried finished textiles to London and Canton. Global trade routes would have bent toward Mumbai instead of Liverpool. The East India Company, originally a modest trading outfit, might have remained just that, a buyer of Indian goods rather than a ruler of Indian lands. Without the lure of exploiting colonial resources, Britain's navy could have stayed a regional force, while Indian investors financed railroads across Eurasia to speed their exports. The Great Game between Russia and Britain, reimagined as a scramble for contracts with the Maratha Confederacy's industrialists who controlled the mountain passes to Central Asia. Even the American South's cotton plantations might have faltered early, outcompeted by India's mechanized output, rendering the transatlantic slave trade less profitable before it ever reached its horrific peak. Technological innovation would have worn a distinctly Indian flavor. Sanskrit texts like the Artha Shastra already detailed metallurgical techniques. Paired with steam power, these could have birthed an indigenous steel boom. Imagine locomotives rolling out of foundries in Jharkhand, their boilers stamped with Ashokan lions instead of British coats of arms. The spinning mule, the power loom, even early calculators, all might have carried the fingerprints of Indian mathematicians and engineers, their designs transmitted along Buddhist trading networks to China and Persia. The intellectual ripple effect would be profound. Universities in Nalanda and Taxila, revived by industrial wealth, could have become the MITs of their day, blending Vedic astronomy with mechanical engineering. Cultural dominance follows economic muscle. With Indian textiles setting global fashions, Parisian couturiers might have sought apprenticeships in Varanasi rather than the other way around. The English language, stripped of its imperial boost, could have remained a minor Germanic dialect, while Hindi or Persian became the lingua franca of commerce and science. Even timekeeping would differ. The Jyoti standard might have been replaced by Indian mean time, calculated from Ujjain's ancient meridian observatory. The very notion of Western civilization as the apex of progress would seem laughable in a world where Bombay Stock Exchange dictated terms to London's. Yet the darkest twist lies in colonialism's reversal. A mechanized India wouldn't just have resisted British rule, it might have become the colonizer. Maratha armadas armed with steam-powered ironclads could have projected power across the Indian Ocean, planting trading posts from Zanzibar to Java. The Opium Wars might have played out in reverse, with Indian merchants supplying Chinese addicts while king officials protested in vain. Europe, meanwhile, could have been relegated to a periphery of squabbling states, its dark continent label applied not to Africa, but to a coal-starved, deindustrialized Britain struggling to keep pace. The Industrial Revolution wasn't destined to bloom in Europe, it was an accident of geography and greed. India had the resources, the skilled labor, and even the proto-capitalist institutions. What it lacked was time. The East India Company's armies smashed looms and severed weavers' thumbs to prevent competition, deliberately deindustrializing Bengal to serve Manchester's rise. The lesson isn't just about what could have been, it's about how fragile our assumptions of historical inevitability truly are. The factories that churned out modernity didn't have to be staffed by children named Oliver Twist. They might have been filled with artisans chanting Vedic hymns as they fed jute into humming mechanical jaws. Some forks in history's road aren't just paths not taken, they're entire worlds paved over before they could be glimpsed. History isn't carved in stone, it's written in sand, reshaped by every gust of wind, every stray footprint, every split-second decision that could have gone the other way. The scenarios we've explored aren't just flights of fancy, they're reminders of how precariously our present balances on the knife's edge of chance. A single storm diverting an invasion fleet, a delayed messenger missing a critical meeting, a fever breaking a day earlier. These microscopic twists could have sent civilization spiraling down entirely different paths. Imagine a world where the Library of Alexandria's flames were drenched by a sudden rain, where Napoleon's artillery found its mark at Waterloo, or where a curious Ming emperor greenlit a second voyage east instead of burning his treasure ships. The threads of what we consider inevitable are far more fragile than we dare admit. What's truly humbling is realizing how many of history's defining moments hinged on luck as much as strategy. The Mongols turning back from Europe wasn't destiny. It was a succession dispute after Urgedei Khan's death. The Allies breaking Nazi codes at Bletchley Park wasn't guaranteed. It relied on capturing a German weather ship with Enigma settings intact. Even the atomic age began because a uranium sample in Chicago didn't spontaneously combust during testing. We like to believe in grand narratives of progress, but so much of it hangs on chaotic, unpredictable details, the kind that could easily have toppled the other way. This isn't just about alternate histories, it's about recognizing the illusions of inevitability. The Roman Empire didn't have to fall. The Industrial Revolution didn't have to start in Britain. The Internet didn't have to emerge from Pentagon research labs. Every paradigm we take for granted was once a mere possibility among countless others, and that's exhilarating. It means our own era's trajectory isn't fixed either. The next 100 years could unfold in ways no futurist would dare predict. Maybe the next Alexander or Einstein is alive right now, their future achievements balancing on something as slight as a teacher's encouragement or a library book left on the right shelf. So what's your favorite hinge point? The moment where history could have slipped its leash and bolted in a wild new direction? Would you rather walk the streets of a world where the Aztecs industrialized, or debate philosophy in a neon-lit Constantinople that never fell? The beauty of these questions is that there are no wrong answers, only endless conversations waiting to unfold. Drop your thoughts below, and who knows, maybe the debates we spark here will ripple further than we imagine. After all, history isn't just something we study, it's something we're all still writing, one unpredictable choice at a time.